All right, thank you very much, Lola, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm sure that many of you may have seen the program and saw that my name was once again on the program and may have, I hope that didn't stop you from coming today. I also hope that what I'm doing here today is not too repetitive. As a matter of fact, I know it's not because I was late to a social engagement last night preparing it, so I think it's relatively new to me, hopefully new to you too. I might start this entire conversation with you, and I'm hoping that it will become a conversation, by telling a story. When I was 17 years old, I was fortunate enough to participate in an exchange. And so my exchange was with Germany, and a young German man my age came and lived with my family and went to school in my high school for a time. And then we both went to Germany and did sort of the same thing in reverse. And when I arrived in Germany, when he arrived in Canada, he spoke very good English. When I arrived in Germany, my German was abysmal, and it, by the way, still is abysmal. But we arrived, and very shortly after my arrival, it was the Easter break. And in Germany at the time, anyway, people had a 2-week break over Easter. And so we decided to trundle off to Paris. And so we got on a train and went there and found a place to stay. And like many Germans, he was very, very disciplined and insisted that the entire time we were together that I speak nothing but German with him. He was going to, even though his English was flawless, he was going to insist that I did not speak English with him. So he would spring out of... We'll start the presentation. That sort of inspired a metaphor that I'd like to use with the talk today, and that is learning to pack your own supplies. Because on that trip, I did not pack my own supplies. I did not have my equivalent of the book, and I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have either the physical baggage or the cultural baggage to understand what it was that I was doing. And I think that this is a quote-unquote trip into the metaphorical world of the source text. So I'd like to talk to you today. Basically, I'm going to break our time together into three units. I'd like to talk to you about micro-level issues of language. And I'll preface this before I get too much further by saying, I know we're a pretty mixed group in the room. There may be some people who have tons of experience and might find that some of the things that I'm saying are old hat to you. And there are some people in the room with less experience, and they may find that some of the things are a little too advanced, but I hope I'm aiming at all levels so I have something in there for everyone. So we'll talk about 3 things. Levels of language. We'll look at the ways in which the text that we have to translate, the text as text, has an effect on how we approach it, and how we engage in that analysis of the source text. And then finally, we'll look at issues of culture and figure out how they impact on our translation. The idea here is that we can look at any given translation in each one of these 3 ways. We can bury our noses into the text and look at it in its very finest details. We can take a step back and get a sense more of its overall shape. And we can take another step back metaphorically and look at who the people are in the process, what their relationship is, and how translation is a nexus between the people. And at the end, we'll do a little bit of a wrap-up and discussion. I'll also apologize by saying that most of my experience with translation does happen through French. And you will see the occasional bits of French here up on the screen. I'm going to try and talk around this so that we dive at a particular point rather than spending too much time looking at the specificities of French. And I'm going to call upon you to try and abstract some of the points that I'm making and think about how they may or may not apply to your particular working languages. Okay, so I want to look at very specific types of things that we need to be able to read and to be ready to address when we look at the source text as language. And I'm going to give you 4 examples, and I'm going to talk them through. The first one I'm going to talk about is transposition. This is not my idea. This comes from 2 gentlemen who wrote about translation in the 50s, Vinet and Dalbonet. And the idea of a transposition, and sometimes my students, when I teach translation, they get a little bit leery about these sorts of things. I like to tell the story of a student. I gave my students a text to translate. This was following the blackout here in Toronto and most of the eastern seaboard in 2003. My students translated the text, and I was looking at one copy, and it said in particular, it was a newspaper article that had been taken from a newspaper in France, looking at how the effects of the blackout were and what things were like as we were coming back, returning to normal. And so the newspaper article said a couple of things about what life coming back to normal was like in various places that had been affected by the blackout. So I picked up the student copy and I read, okay, so people are collecting garbage again in the streets of New York. The gas stations in Chicago are pumping gas again. And in the high-tech hotels of Boston, the chase for electronic water is on again. Okay, and I knew immediately that there was a problem. Those of you in the room that do have some French, the original French said, dans les hôtels haute technologie de Boston, la chasse d'eau électronique fonctionne à nouveau. Right? So can you translate that back for me? What's a chasse d'eau in French? What do you do when you have to use the bathroom? Flush, okay. So you know you go into a hotel and you don't have to do it manually. There's the little electronic doodad that flushes for you. So I went back to her and I said, exactly what do you think electronic water is? and that begs the question too, why would we chase it? And she said to me, well, that's what the text said. And it's true, those were the individual words of the text, but as we all know, that's not what the text meant. So, same idea. When we're approaching the text for the first time and we have our nose buried in it, there are words in the text, and we do at some point have to realize that the movement from our source language to our target language will imply changing the words, obviously. So the idea behind a transposition is just that sometimes we will have an idea expressed in a certain way in one language, and we'll need to express it differently, notably by changing the part of speech. So just because something is phrased, and we heard Helen talk about this earlier today, just because something is phrased as a verb in one language doesn't have to mean that it's communicated as a verb in your translation. As a matter of fact, there may actually be some rules, there may be some impediments in your target language that stop you from expressing that as a verb. And so you need to make that shift. And very often when we're starting out, we're afraid to make those kinds of shifts. But they are in fact necessary. So here are a couple of quick examples. In English, we look at a source text and we might read something that says, as soon as he got up. We need to phrase that information in verb form because in English we don't have a noun form equivalent to his upgetting. Okay? But other languages might. So I think this is notably the case of our Romance languages where there exist words in noun form for this sort of thing. So the idea here is move from a verb into a noun as we're translating. He merely nodded. So this idea of not quite, which is expressed in the adverb merely in English, we can change it over in other languages if it suits our purposes into another part of speech. And here what the French does is it gets that idea of merely by putting it into a verb. So he contented himself to nod his head, is what we might say in French. So again, we're not too tied to any particular part of speech. Same idea here, another adverb, he will soon be back, he won't delay in returning. We're changing the words, but the idea remains the same, most notably because we're moving from one part of speech to another. Okay, so that was transposition. You're with me so far? We're just going to change the part of speech as we're moving across. And the idea is, as we pick up that source text for the first time, we're going to say to ourselves, as we're reading through it, can I automatically pick out the parts that I'm going to need to transfer in this way? Are there some constructions in the English that as I work into my language, I'm going to need to change the part of speech, for example? Either because I have no choice. If I were working back from the French into English, I don't have any choice. There's no such noun as upgetting, so I have to put it into a verb. So sometimes it's going to be necessary grammatically, lexically, because we don't have any other tools. And other times it's simply going to be a matter of idiomaticity. In other words, what sounds, what reads most naturally for a native speaker? What would we ordinarily do if there was not that interference from the source text? Okay, so moving on, another tool here. This is modulation. Modulation means coming at the idea from a different angle. So if in the source text, for example, it says, it's not difficult to show this, that, or the other, and for whatever reasons it complicates matters, if we're trying to say that in the other language, can we turn it around? If it's not difficult, then that means it's easy, right? So can we say, it's easy to show X, Y, Z? Or sometimes we might have a gap, a lexical gap in our language. So this is the case. French doesn't really have a word for shallow. It has one for deep. It doesn't have one for shallow. So what do you say? Shallow is little deep or a little bit deep. Okay? French also has this problem with cheap and expensive. It has a word for expensive. It doesn't have a word for cheap, not in the sense of inexpensive. So what they often say is it's not very expensive. So we have to turn this around and come at it from the other angle. Interesting, I heard a scientist talk one time, and he said that in order to do good science, to look at a problem in a creative way, we have to sort of spread our legs like this, turn our back to the problem, and bend down and look at it like that. And so modulation is a bit the same idea. On a hotel, or an inn, or a bed and breakfast, if there's no rooms left, in English we say no vacancy. In French, the other way we can look at it is to say, well, if there are sort of no empty spaces, it means that it's full. So the idea here is simply, don't get stuck, don't get caught by the words, look for other ways of expressing the same idea, maybe by coming at it from a different angle. Punctuation. Sometimes in our languages, we're going to have different sets of punctuation tools. They won't necessarily correspond to what we find in our source language. And as we scan through that source text, as we're doing that reading, that analysis, we're going to be on the lookout for those and saying, right, that one, I need to change that. We don't have it in my other language, or it doesn't work the same way in my other language. Here are a couple of examples. Silence is consent. And notice in English mark that I have I have my quotation marks with 66 and 99. And in French, quotation marks look a lot different typographically. And there you have an example. And I know that this holds for some other languages that are out there. The Germans like to park the 66s on the bottom of the line and put the 99s up top or whatever. So maybe the quotation marks don't apply to your particular language, but are there other examples? You know, Spanish has the upside down exclamation mark that has to go at the beginning, or the upside down question mark that has to go at the beginning. So think about, are there differences, are there tools in my other language that don't exist in English if I'm using that as a source language? This is a little bit more tricky. So here's an example taken from a newspaper text in English. It's talking about the fate of our poor Liberal Party at the national level. And the text at the very end, the journalist says, "Fun? You don't hear a lot of Liberals talking about that these days." I was able to find almost the exact thing in French. And what's interesting is at the end of the sentence, they say the exact same thing. Fun, you don't hear a lot of Liberals saying that, ... And I know that when I ask my students to work in the other direction, they start with the source text in French and they translate into English, very often their texts are all full of these ellipsis points, ... Actually, the name even points out the problem. Their texts are all full of these 3 dots. And that's problematic in English for a couple of reasons. In English, we call this ellipsis. Why do we call it ellipsis? Do you know? When do we use ellipsis in English?
When you skip something.
When you skip something, there's a gap. Maybe I'm quoting somebody and not all of their quote is relevant or pertinent, or maybe I don't have space. And so that's one use of ellipsis. French actually calls them the 3 dots, and it uses them to sort of say, hey audience, wink, I'm saying something ironic or funny or something that I want you to sort of smile wryly at. Okay? So realize that just because something punctuation-wise is in the text, in the source text, doesn't mean that we have to slavishly copy it over. As a matter of fact, it's going to start looking funny. We have English newspaper text with all kinds of ellipsis points in them when we're not leaving information out. Readers are going to scratch their head and say, that seems odd. It doesn't seem like a well-written text. Another more tricky issue is that in English, and this is tied to the fact we were hearing Helen talk about keep it simple, stupid. In English, we do tend to like to have simple sentences. Our idea of good writing is simple writing. Noun, verb, information, and the predicate. Other languages have other patterns. They like to see more complexity. Good writing is writing that involves some effort on the part of the reader to make their way through the text. So in English, we very often see very simple sentences like the ones on the screen. He stared at me, period. I began to worry, period. In other languages, we may try to combine things together more commonly with other types of punctuation. Here in French, what they've done is they've joined it together with a semicolon. I always know that I'm reading, if I'm reading a text in English that's been written by some of my students, if it's peppered all the way through with semicolons, joining sentences together willy-nilly, I know that it's been written by a francophone because these punctuation marks are used differently in the two languages. Okay? So again here, the idea is not to dwell too much on French, but to get your wheels turning and saying, what are the cases with my language pairs where things like punctuation might differ, either because they have to, the marks don't exist, so in the case of the punctuation, of the quotation marks rather with French, the actual marks themselves are different in the two languages, or because the frequency of use is different between the two. We tend to see one, although it's possible to use it, but we tend not to see it in one language, we tend to see it more in the other. And the final tool that I'll throw out before I get you to do a tiny bit of work is syntactical changes. So when is it more normal, more sort of habitual for us to make some changes in the way that we convey information using syntax? So here's an example. I don't know if your target language causes you to sort of scratch your head when you see this in English, but one of the things we tend to do in English quite easily is we show a lot of motion through prepositions. We also have verbs, and I'll get to that in a second, that can show you both manner and motion, so do double duty. And in some languages it's difficult to do this. So in a language like English, I can say something like, he swam across the river. In French, I have more trouble with this because the preposition won't communicate movement very well. So instead, I have to say, he crossed the river at a swim. So think about your language as you look at English prepositions. Do they cause a headache for you? Similar thing here. She tiptoed down the stairs. The preposition is showing the movement, and the verb is showing manner. In the other language, I have to do it the other way around. So she went down in the verb, she descended the stairs, and manner I've got with this prepositional phrase, on the tips of her feet. Okay? So just because information is packaged one way in one language doesn't mean that we have to slavishly copy it into the other. And this is the famous one. I think this really demonstrates the idea of prepositions. Sorry, there's a verb missing there in English. He took the train to Toronto, is what the English should say. And in French, we have problems with that to and the from. We need to expand them into something that we call stuffing. We need to stuff them with more information. And so what we need to say in French is something to the effect of, he took the train to destination of Toronto. So that preposition alone isn't powerful enough to show me the motion from one place to the other. I need other words in there. Okay. So all this simply to say, what I want you to get out of this is that just because something is phrased in a very particular way in one language doesn't mean that we have to copy it exactly. We can play with the syntax, we can play with the formulation, we can play with the punctuation, sometimes because it's obligatory, we have no other choice, and sometimes because it allows us to produce a text that sounds like it was written originally in our language. Okay. All right, so now I want to play a game of translation bingo with you. In just a couple of moments, I'm going to put a very short text up on the screen, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes around your table to sort of consult with one another. So you're going to work in table teams, okay? And this is what I want you to do. You're going to read the text over when I show it to you. It's a source text in English. And I want you to think about, because I suspect that we have many different languages in some cases represented around a table. You may have somebody there who shares your working languages, you may not. But I want you to think about what would it take, you can even draft a translation if you want, but what would it take to translate the text into your language? And I want you to try and come up with examples. One example of a transposition, a modulation, a punctuation shift or a syntactical change that you either have to make as you're translating out of English into your language, or that you should make because it makes the text easier to read. Okay? So the first table that collectively, so maybe, for example, if the colleagues are working with Chinese, then the bit about transposition might be hard because morphologically Chinese doesn't mark differences between nouns and verbs. So that one's going to be kind of a moot point for you. But maybe the Spanish colleague at your table can come up with an example of transposition. But you can come up with Chinese an example of punctuation. Collectively together, the first table that is able to come up with one example of each of the 4 types, I want somebody from that table to jump up and yell bingo. Okay? And then we'll talk it over and see how that works out. I've given you examples for other languages, for French or other, and I want you to give me examples for other languages. Is that relatively clear what I'm asking you to do?
Yes.
Yeah? Are there any questions before we start? Okay. So, hopefully you can read this. Here is your text. People at the back, can you see this? Mary's nodding yes. Okay. The groan is because you like the topic or because it's hard to read? Both? It's long. It's not very long. You don't have to translate it in full. Just scan through it. If it helps you to translate some bits, then go ahead. But you can also just scan through it. You have a couple of minutes to do this. So there's no big bad hurry. Question at the back. Could I make it bigger? So here's what we're going to do. I am going to ask a representative of what I think is the first table to have called bingo to stand up and to explain the 4 examples that they have. And if the rest of the group should, in listening to them and paying careful attention to what they're saying, should decide that that's not a true example of one of the 4 types, then we can move over to another table so we can sort of steal their thunder from them. How does that sound? Okay, so the table at the back, if you've got a representative who's willing to stand up, and so you can either do it from the table, or if we're having trouble hearing, I might ask you to come to the mic, whatever you're more comfortable with. All right, mic it is.
Okay, the first example for Spanish will be who rocketed. In this case, the verb we change it into quien ascendió rápidamente. So we didn't have that quickly, so we need to change it from the verb to that. I mean, the verb in itself.
Adverb.
Yeah.
Okay, was there somebody's contesting?
I disagree because quien ascendió is also another verb. So you're just putting changing one verb to another, you're just adding an adverb, but you're not making a transposition from one
No.
verb.
May I?
Go ahead.
En ascendió rápidamente, yo estoy agregándole el rápidamente para dar la idea de velocidad que tiene el rocketed, que no la tiene en español la palabra ascender sola por sí sola.
Okay, I'm going to stop this here because some of us can't participate in this conversation. So don't go too far. I am going to hand the floor back over to you. But here's how I would break this down. In the Spanish example, we're showing motion in the verb, and we're showing manner with an adverb. Right? So we know it's going up. We now need to qualify that motion. What is it like? Is it slow? Is it fast? Is it forward? Is it backward? What is it? Okay? In the English, What is rocket? What information is contained in the verb rocketed? Motion and manner. So we've got both. So I would consider this, if I get to judge, and I think I do because it's my talk. I think that's legitimate, but it's an interesting conversation to try and take this apart. Okay, next example.
So what again? Yeah, but she's not saying what kind of example is that. Transposition.
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 Okay. About punctuation, we in our table decided that we don't write a comma before and. We don't, no tenemos coma delante de la preposición y. Eso sería, that will be an example of punctuation. Was that clear? Is anyone against?
Okay, hang on, we got some rumbling. Okay, rumbling in the crowd. Those of you that are rumbling and grumbling, why? Talk to me. You object? You agree? You disagree? You agree. Okay. So a voice shouted out in the back, yes, same as French. So in some languages, if I say A, B, and C, okay, in English, it's A, comma, B, and now I have the choice in English, depending on which style guide I follow, of either putting the comma in before the and, which is what we call a series comma, or in English I can omit it. So both are permissible. If you have a choice, just stick to one choice. Don't be changing it halfway through a text. Or if you have a client and says, this is our style guide, or we follow Chicago style, or we follow whatever style, then that tells you what you have to do. Other languages, Spanish, French, maybe others that are represented in the room, don't have the series comma. It's A, comma, B, and C. Only one comma in the list of three things, or three or more. Okay, next example, please.
Then we have syntax, the one he was born into. We change passive into active. El quien nació, no quien was born into, right? And we don't have that into, well, that's part of born into, that doesn't exist in Spanish, right? And,
so just because there's some grumbling, you understand that the move was from the passive voice in English, was born, to the active voice. In English it's not possible, we don't have an active verb that conveys this information. But if the word birthed, for example, means something different. If I say that Jack Layton birthed, what does that mean? That he himself had a baby, right? So probably didn't happen. But there may be in other languages examples of the active voice that we can plug in here, and I would consider that an acceptable example of syntactical shift. Sentence, and then we provide all sorts of information about a single idea. This is jumping around like a Mexican jumping bean, right? There are all kinds of ideas. And so I went back to that student and I said, we have a problem, you have no coherence, we need to work on this. And I initially thought, the student's in the wrong, this is an isolated case, we need to correct this and show him, quote unquote, the right way of writing a paragraph. But as I proceeded to see this in student after student after student, I realized that something was up. And that the student wasn't wrong, it was probably me who was being stupid and ignorant of how text takes form in different cultures. And so sure enough, I spoke to one of my graduate students who is a native Farsi speaker, and she said, Andrew, you know about one of the most important literary and therefore text types in the Farsi-speaking thought world is the ghazal, which is a kind of poem. And I don't know much about the ghazal, and there are probably many people in the room who know much more than I do. But let me tell you what little I do know. So here's an example. This is one that's written in English. It's called Whiskey Tears by a poet named Kathy Egan. Time and laughter disappear on the crest of whiskey tears. Christmas shimmers in the air, season blessed through whiskey tears. Wind-blown cairns of brick and glass coalesced from whiskey tears. Kathy went to midnight mass. She confessed in whiskey tears. Some of you are seeing this form for the first time. What are some of its hallmarks? What are you noticing right away about it? There's repetition, so we get the whiskey tears, whiskey tears, whiskey tears. What else? It's a poem, it rhymes. What else?
It's a little bit dreamlike. It's as if there is no logical progression.
No logical progression. That's interesting, and we'll come back to that. What else?
It looks some complaints somewhere.
It looks what?
Complaints. Complaints.
Sorry, I'm not hearing very well.
Complaints.
It's complex, okay?
Somebody is complaining about something.
It's a complaint. Oh, sorry. Yes, yes, yes.
It seems to be jumping all over the place with different ideas.
It does jump around the place, but there is a kind of organization to this.
To my mind, it's...
Sorry, somebody in the back here.
This is typical of ghazal, where there is a broader idea and there are components. They all come together.
Okay. And I have a word up in a little bubble there beside ghazal. What does it say? The idea is that it comes in pairs, right? The two lines are always matched together. And from what little I understand, often a ghazal is sort of a complaint and a celebration at the same time. It's often about, oh my goodness, the pain of love, but isn't it great to be in love anyway? So if I jump back, pardon me, just 2 seconds here. If I jump back to this, can you see duality in this? City has a prison, lots of prisoners in it. Okay, so two ideas in the first sentence. We jump. Those prisoners defended rights. Okay? What happened to the people who defended their rights? They died, went into the graveyard, and it's big. Lots of people in it. Most of those people, large numbers of people, executed by religious leaders. So always, it's jumping around, but there's always this idea of duality, duality, duality. So fast forward now. About 6 years ago, at a point of a very sort of low point in relations between, I mean, is there ever a high point in relations between the US and Iran? I don't know. But at a particularly low point, then still president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, decided to write an open letter to George Bush. And so I have a bit of that letter, and I just want to read a little bit from the letter to you. So he says, writes to George Bush, President of the US, says, "Can one be a follower of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, the great messenger of God, feel obliged to respect human rights, present liberalism as a civilization model, announce one's opposition to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, make war on terror his slogan, and finally work towards the establishment of a unified international community, a community which Christ and the virtuous of the earth will one day govern." Next paragraph. "But at the same time, have countries attacked, the lives, reputations, and possessions of people destroyed, and on the slight chance of the presence of a few criminals in a village, city, or convoy, for example, the entire village, city, or convoy is set ablaze. Or because of the possibility of the existence of weapons of mass destruction in one country, it is occupied, around 100,000 people killed, its water sources, agriculture, industry destroyed, close to 180,000 foreign troops put on the ground, etc., etc." When this letter was translated into English and printed and commented on in English-speaking sources in the US and other English-speaking countries, the comment that came up time and time again is that this was the ranting of a madman, that it's not coherent, that it didn't make sense, that people couldn't understand what he was talking about. And I think this was caused by the same reaction that I had to my Francophone students' essays, and to the same reaction that I had to some of my Farsi-speaking students' essay writing as well. What's going on in this text immediately that you can see? I would argue we've got duality going on again, right? So on one hand, the whole thing is a giant metaphor saying on one hand and on the other, right? That's getting us right back to, oh, the pain of love, but isn't it wonderful? Right? So how can you be on one hand all of these things and yet do all of these on the other? It does jump around, but we're expecting that. That's not a sign of incoherence, it's a sign that I know how to write a text of a given structure. Okay? So the point that I want you to take home from all of this is that there are times when we look at a text, a source text for the first time. Let's say it's in English, and the English thought world is not the one that we grew up in. We often have a tendency to say, oh, that's badly written. It's incoherent, it doesn't make sense. How many people have had occasion to say that? Oh, this text is poorly written. Really? I would expect every hand in the room to go up.
There are texts that are badly written.
There are texts that are badly written. I'm not here today to say that there are not. But sometimes what we think is badly written is really just a lack of awareness on our part. So, I'm going to skip through this. Here is, again, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. Here is a text that I found in a German newspaper and that I translated very closely into English for you. Can anybody tell me, if we had to give a name to this type of text, what would we call it? It's an obituary. So, I want you, in the next 5 to 10 minutes, to talk in your groups and say, what changes would you make to this beyond the very basic translation into English that I've done here for you? What changes would you make to this if you had to print this in an English newspaper? So in other words, is this the way we normally write an obituary in English? Yes, no. If you think no, what changes would you have to make? So I'm going to start by giving you 5 minutes. Just have a discussion in your group.
Start first with the person's name, Jenny Francis. Okay. And her birthday or her date. Okay, so Jenny. I don't know. Maybe you disagree. Thank you very much. Jenny Francis.
And that's great, but I'm hoping that just in a couple of minutes we can maybe summarize some of the things, some of the features of this particular text that need to be changed. We have one thing, one change first of all. Can somebody give me an example of one thing that you would change?
Yes.
I'm going to go over to this side.
I would definitely change my dear wife, my dear mother.
So, my dear wife, my dear mother, what would you change it to?
Beloved wife or dear wife, dear mother.
Okay, so the first person, my, who is it that's speaking? Not clear for us? So let's change this to maybe a third person construction, dear wife of or beloved mother of. Okay? Another change.
English requires space between the apostrophe S and St. Mary's and the opening.
Yeah, I think that's actually just a typo on my part. But, can you tell that I am not a reviser? Yeah.
Indeed, sadness doesn't refer to the deceased. It has to be the family which is that is saddened by the passing of Jenny Francis. As it reads, it may imply that the deceased was in deep sadness.
Okay. So the question was, the way it reads now, we might be tempted to think that it's Jenny Francis who's in deep sadness, but in fact she's the person who's passed away.
Yeah.
Okay? So we need to sort of arrange the name of the person a little bit differently. How about one more thought from a non-usual suspect? Carla? Okay, so date and time not set up with the typical punctuation in English. Okay, and so does this make you feel a little bit better?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I heard one of the tables say, oh, her last name was Francis. What's the Elton business? That is the community where she passed away. So Elton was not her name. Her name was Jenny Francis.
So is that
So one of the takeaway points that I'd like to leave you with on this section is that watch out when we first look at something that is a structure, a textual structure that is socially produced, culturally produced. If we're not familiar with it, our tendency is to think that there's something wrong with it, or that it's incoherent. Or we may even misunderstand it entirely. So some of you were saying, oh, her last name wasn't Elton, it was Francis, right? So if we're unfamiliar with those text conventions, there may be some confusion in our minds. And so again, we need to educate ourselves first and foremost. And I'm sorry to flog a dead horse here, but I think there are very few ways of educating ourselves outside of reading. Hand over here.
Well, isn't it the point of translating a document is to have somebody understand that? So, will the changes be necessary? To me they are. So my target audience will actually understand. So it's my job to educate myself and clarify those things in order to have a translation that is actually going to be understood by my target audience.
Okay, so just to summarize the comment, I don't need to be here because she's just given the presentation for me. And the question was basically, isn't my job to know enough about the differences between the way texts are structured in language A and language B, so that I can shift from one to the other, that ideas are communicated clearly, and everyone is happy with the product at the end? Is that basically what you're saying? And the answer is yes. That is your job. But be careful. Be careful, because if we jump back to that obituary example, the two texts look very different, right? They're visually quite different. And so sometimes, and I would stress that word, sometimes the act of translation and even just the reading of the source text is going to require us to be sometimes very heavy-handed in what we do to the translation. But the trick is to figure out when that's okay and when it's not, right? So before you make any sort of textual changes of the sort that I've shown you here, you need to be extremely, extremely certain. So first off, I would suggest you do kind of a cost-benefit analysis. What are, maybe you don't need to write this out, but at least in your own head say, if I leave the structure the way it is, the way I first, for example, translated the obituary, what are the risks and what are the advantages, okay, of just leaving it the way it was? One of the risks is some of you misunderstood that the information was being transmitted. So that's a risk. If you change, if you overhaul things, what are the risks and the benefits? In this case, people understand, but the risk might be that you get it wrong. Okay? Unless you're 100% sure that you've understood the way the structures work differently in the two languages, you might get it wrong. So this is not something I normally recommend to my beginning students.
Yeah, but even if we get it right, the client might not be pleased with the way we did it.
Okay, so again, I don't even need to be here because you're giving my presentation for me. The last point is use professional judgment to choose a path. So the comment to the back was, even if I'm right and justified and I do have a very solid understanding of the differences in the text types, I may still nevertheless upset the client, right? And so that's where, as the service provider, you need to step back and say, what do I know about the client? What kind of history do I have with this person? What sort of wiggle room am I able to give myself? And so you're going to access that sense of professional judgment that we're all trying to develop very hard in our work. You're going to access that and have that be your guide. One last comment before we move on.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in looking at the two, and unless I missed something, on the right, you didn't mention passed away. It is implied, given that it's an obituary. So the word passed, the term passed away, unless I'm not seeing it somewhere, it's not there. So there's this, again, you have to understand the context, and the English reader, it's an obituary, it's implied that the person is deceased.
Yeah, I sometimes get myself into trouble with my students because there are many occasions where I say, you can make changes, and this is one, what the French call économie par évidence. If something is evident, it doesn't need to appear. So when asked how to translate a bird flew into the room, if you ask a French person how to say that, chances are they'll say, what they'll say is the equivalent of a bird entered the room, right? And we don't get the information that it flew, because unless it's an ostrich, that's probably how it got in there. So it's the same idea here, but again, we're talking, to know when you can do that and when you can't requires professional judgment. I do need, in the interest of time, to move on. Okay, so the last step that we're going to take is to take that giant step backwards and say, I'm not just translating words, I'm not just translating text, I'm also translating for people who are in connection with one another, the source language culture, the target language culture, and you know what? These people don't always have the same access to information or power. So, just want you to listen to the sound of this. This is, again, one of Andrew's quick and dirty translations. The castle, a modern Italian construction, with its 2 advancing wings and its 3 staircases, was spread out at the far end of an immense lawn where several cows wandered between several well-spaced clusters of trees, while rows of bushes and rhododendrons punctuated with their irregular tufts the wavy line traced by the sandy road. So that's Gilbert writing in 1857. And we look at an English writer this time, this is Hemingway, in 1929, saying, "The plain was rich with crops. There were many orchards of fruit trees, and beyond the plain the mountains were brown and bare. There was fighting in the mountains, and at night we could see the flashes from the artillery." What do you notice right away in terms of style? How would you describe the sentences? So somebody said choppy. Who's choppy? Chunky?
Dividing the text into smaller sections.
Which one?
Well, there was one sentence in the previous one.
Yeah. So if we can really overgeneralize and call one French and one English. So the French one giant sentence, very complex. The English one, much more simple, choppy, chunked up, right? Even when the sentences are longer, for example, there was fighting in the mountains, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5-ish lines. I know they're short, but still. But they're simple sentences joined with and, right? There was this, and there was that. Very simple, simple construction. Okay, so fast forward now. This is a text some of you may have read in the original French, or maybe you've read it in translation. This is Albert Camus, writing from L'Étranger, the stranger, the outsider. It has both those titles in English. And this is the opening to the text. Today mother died, period. Or maybe yesterday, I don't know. I got a telegram from the home, mother deceased, funeral tomorrow, sincerely. That doesn't mean anything, maybe it was yesterday. The rest of the book is exactly like this. It continues on in this exact same vein. So, when I look at the difference, look at the distance between this as an endpoint and our two starting points. So, knowing that Camus was writing in French and that his readers were used to looking at Flaubert and company, think of the distance, the ground that Camus is covering in terms of creativity, originality. And then compare that with the ground that's covered in the mind of the English reader who's used to Hemingway and then picks up Camus. And what I'm arguing is that on the French side, Camus is much, much more of a departure from what people are used to. On the English side, there's not so much of a departure. And in fact, when the first translation of L'Étranger made it to American shores, people went, meh. While the French thought world was abuzz. Some people hated it, some people loved it, but everybody was talking about it. And on the other side of the pond, or even across the other side of the channel, people were scratching their heads saying, what's all the fuss about? So, the idea here is that I'm the furthest thing in the world from an artist, but I do have friends who are artists, and sometimes they will tell me that the whole point in creative endeavor is to take the medium that everybody has used before, whether that's paint or clay or words, the language, and the point is to use it in a new way that is revolutionary and different. Right? I don't know the first thing about art, but when I was a student in Europe, I did go to all of the big museums. I went to the Louvre, I went to all the big collections and saw these wonderful masterpieces that previously I'd only seen in books, and I sat back and I said, wow, I definitely can't do that. Then I lived in Ottawa as a public servant for a while, and I went to a museum there, and I saw one of the pieces that they have, and I've forgotten the artist's name, but it's basically a giant canvas with one stripe down. And I looked at it and I thought, I can't do that. Right? But that's not the point. The point is that it's taken what's gone before and turned it on its ear. Right? So, just in the interest of time, I'm going to maybe just not, I had planned to sort of have you discuss this in table groups, but let's do this together. What do you think, and I've kind of given you a hint of this, what do you think the reaction of the French audiences are going to be to something like Camus? They're used to the Flaubert style, long, drawn out, and they, all of a sudden they pick up Camus for the first time, they give it a read, and what kind of reaction are you going to have?
But the fuss was actually about the morality of the main character, Meursault, because, as you know, the Meursault, even from that first sentence, from the opening of the novel,
we see his, and he went after that to the cinema to watch the movie. As far as I remember, I watched that. I read that novel like 40 years ago. But the fuss was about immorality, that he was a moral figure, and that was something that was completely new in French literature.
Okay, so the comment was that, Andrew, there's actually a lot more going on in the book than just the telegraphic style, and I'm not denying that. I'm very, very poorly positioned to stand up here and talk to you about French literature, really, in terms of its merits. But as a translator, I do find this one aspect of it very interesting. So the comment was, Andrew, the book is about more than that. It's really about exploration of personal morality. Because the next thing the character does is goes and watches a movie, and then he winds up shooting a man on a beach for no apparent reason, and blah, blah, blah. So there are other things going on in the novel, and I'm not denying that. The focus of my attention here is this as an interest for us as translators. So again, I want to get back to the reaction that people might have had just to the style of the writing initially.
Andrew, I think what she was trying to say is that there's a link between the style and the morality. Both of them were things that French didn't expect. So there's a link there, a parallel between the two.
Yeah.
So further to the point was that it's not a coincidence that thematically the book is exploring morality and unexpected morality, and that the style is also unexpected. There's a link there. And I'm not denying that. My purpose today is much, much less complex than that. But sure, over here.
Yes, I think from the literature point of view, you have to see that Flaubert, maybe he wrote that excerpt from the metaphorical. So he describing maybe the scenery. Now with the excerpt from the book, he describing maybe a war, and with the concept and the community, you can see that even you don't know the book, but you read that, you could tell that it is psychological problem. He talked about the death of his mother, so that I see that from the literature point of view. That's why we have different texts, different style.
Okay. So the colleague is saying to us that there are different things going on, and that some of the choices are motivated by what the goal of these novels is. On one hand, to talk about, to describe the lusciousness of some scenery. On the other hand, to talk about the dreadful nature of war. On the third, to sort of talk about the despair that we might feel in sort of our internal psychological life. So that's valid. I'm not denying that. But again, what I am interested in is the sort of reaction that the people might have to looking at this for the first time. Mary.
So, the simple part. Some hated it, most hated it, because that's new and unknown. And some saw a genius in it, because it's something totally different.
Thank you.
Because of the style, right?
Okay, so the comment was, some hated it, some loved it, some people hated it because it was so radically different, some loved it, they thought it was genius. And the corollary to that, the English audience, I mean, I suggested this already, but the English audience, very often, if you go back and you read the reviews of the translation, people were just not getting it. People were just not getting it. As a matter of fact, to the point where they were saying, there were a lot of disparaging comments that were made about the author and about French society in general. And there was a lot of sort of snobbishness on the part of English speakers who were looking at this and saying, oh, those French. You know, what are they on about now, and yada, yada, yada.
But
and
that
the thing...
that was also a new way in literature and philosophy, existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus. So that was, again, what was revolutionary.
Okay, so the colleague is saying that this is all piggybacking on other movements in philosophy, for example. And again, I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that. What I do, maybe a question that I want to leave you with, because I realize that our time is coming to an end. The question that I do want to leave you with on this point is this. Not only is this about a novel and the translation of a novel, it's also the bringing together of two different thought worlds. It's the bringing together of two different thought worlds that have very often been within visual range of one another, whether that's in Europe or in Canada. English speakers have met French speakers before. In Canada, we live in the same country. In Europe, there's a broader institution that they're both part of. They have regular contact with one another. So, and they're also kind of on more or less the same playing field. But what were to happen if the translation were not from French and not from a French author, but instead from an author writing in a language that came from a developing nation, or a nation that had been a former colony? And people had looked at it and said, meh, I don't get it. What's the fuss all about? And so the question that I would leave, and I don't have an answer, is, as translators, do we have a duty, in some cases, to stop? I mean, the reaction may be more than just meh. It may be looking down our noses again and continuing in a pattern of denigration of people and saying, oh, you know, those savages over in X land, they don't know how to write, or they think they have literature. And so the question that I would leave you with is it the role of the translator to step in and to either mitigate that, to stop that looking down the nose, or at very least not perpetuate it? So if I think about everything sort of on a broader level, what do I take away from the macro level? Think carefully about the relationship between the source culture, the text, the target culture. What do power relations look like between the two? If there's a gap that's left unaddressed, will it have unintended consequences? And what strategies, if any, would we put in place? So to sum up, I want you to think, as you approach that source text the next time, I want you to be thinking in terms of those three levels. Most of your work, arguably, will happen at that micro level. No one will deny that you need to play with language and to produce a text that is both faithful and corresponds to the original, but at the same time is idiomatic and meets the need of your target audience. I also want you to think in terms of text and to think about, is this form familiar to the people that are going to read it? Is that going to suit their purposes? Is there any information or any impressions that are going to be formed that are misleading because I have or haven't modified the form? And then finally, who are the people that are coming into play? And in what way is the act of translation doing this or doing this in terms of the relationship between the two people? And so there I'm going to start.